Remember that scene in Hardboiled where Inspector Tequila took out an attack helicopter with an M60 from the ground with next to no cover? No? Probably because it didn't happen in Hardboiled, but in the film's official sequel, Stranglehold. What is Stranglehold, you might be asking? Well, it's certainly not The Last Blood, which was confusingly retitled to Hardboiled 2 in the UK when it finally hit home video. No, Stranglehold is actually the licensed continuation of one of John Woo's most cherished films in the form of a video game released for 7th generation consoles in 2007. Developed by Midway Studios Chicago and published by Midway Games, Stranglehold was billed as the perfect encapsulation of John Woo's balletic action style to video game format. Special editions on the PlayStation 3 even included a copy of Hardboiled in HD, though it was essentially the DVD in an awkward border with really lousy audio. How did this game come to be? While fans of Hong Kong action films were seeing a small boost of popularity to their favorite movies in the early aughts, creating a sequel to Hardboiled more than a decade after its release is not something one could have reasonably expected. Hardboiled had seen a home release by the Criterion Collection in the US, but it wasn't widely available overseas to even say that John Woo's production company was taking notice of rising interest or anything. What most people probably didn't realize is that Woo himself founded a gaming company called Tiger Hill Entertainment in 2003 with the intention of creating games true to the style of his films. There's not a whole lot of information available on Tiger Hill Entertainment presently, but we do know of a canceled follow-up to Stranglehold that would have been titled Shadow Clan. It wasn't another sequel, but that's neither here nor there. An actual sequel titled Gunrunner was also canceled, but the only surviving video shows a lot of placeholder content with not only Chow Yun-fat in the game, but Vin Diesel from publisher Midway Games as Wheelman. Chances are it was never going to be a direct sequel. Still, Woo was on board with the idea and creation of the game, and that quickly followed after PsyOps the Mindgate Conspiracy wrapped development in 2004, which was Midway Games Chicago's previous game. So, how and why did Stranglehold become a sequel to Hardboiled? I don't have an answer for that question. While the Hong Kong film industry was no stranger to sequels, and John Woo even made A Better Tomorrow 2 as a direct continuation of the first film, you'd often see thematic sequels more than story continuations. Continuity was never a big focus of Hong Kong filmmaking, and it seems pretty odd that Woo would give the okay to a Western development studio to create a sequel to one of his most beloved movies. Seeing as how the game would be Western developed, though, I imagine the answer was because of Hardboiled's popularity overseas. In the September '93 issue of Spin magazine, Woo was interviewed about the inspiration of his movies and his then new transition to Hollywood filmmaking. When discussing the reception to Hardboiled, Woo stated, "I found out Western audiences love it more than The Killer. The critics liked The Killer more because it mixed the action with the art. But movie lovers liked Hardboiled. We can argue day in and day out about which of John Woo's films is his true masterpiece," pulling in the head, "but it's always been pretty clear that Westerners prefer Hardboiled. With that said, I can only imagine that the team at Midway Studios Chicago fell into the same boat and jumped at the notion of creating a sequel to Inspector Tequila's kinetic battle against crime. At the time of its release, Stranglehold was pretty well received, but didn't garner the type of acclaim you would have expected from a John Woo property. On Metacritic across its various platforms, the game rests at a solid 77 out of 100, and while you could pick out reviews which go lower, there was a common complaint from everyone that had played the game. It was far too short. When I played it again to capture footage for this video, I managed to beat it on the hard difficulty in a little over 4 hours. When you can routinely find it on sale from GOG.com for $2, that's actually a pretty good deal. Taken at its original $60 MSRP, that does seem pretty lousy. This video isn't meant to be a review of the game, however. One thing I've always been puzzled by is how John Woo fans never seem to mention Stranglehold when talking about his work. I know that a certain subset of fans seem to think that A Better Tomorrow, The Killer, and Hardboiled were the only movies he ever directed, but Woo's career is filled with interesting diversions and complete swerves. That said, for as much as Hardboiled is propped on a pedestal by its fans, you'd think they'd also be bringing up Stranglehold in the same breath. I can't claim that the story of Stranglehold is actually any good, and I'm still baffled that the whole thing was written and performed in English rather than Cantonese, but there are some surprising layers of depth given to Tequila during his crusade against Dragonclaw leader Jimmy Wong. While Tequila is more of a loner in Hardboiled, in Stranglehold he's actually intimate with Wong's daughter, Billy. The two fell in love and concocted a plan to get her out of Hong Kong and away from her mobster father. At some point, they had a child together, which Wong then kidnaps to lure Tequila back into action so he can kill him. It's all very cliched and kind of ridiculous, but I find it fascinating that Woo allowed writer Tony Peterson to create a scenario where one of his characters actually moved on with their life following the intense conclusion from Hardboiled. The impression I always got from Tequila after his standoff with Johnny Wong is that he was a cop through and through, and nothing would ever change that. Instead, it seems that Tequila gave himself some respite so that his life wouldn't be filled with needless violence. Again, a lot of this doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, as the general plot for Stranglehold is more an excuse to get Tequila into gunfights. It's nice that Chow Yun-fat reprised his role and even participated in the motion capture for his character, but a lot of it gets ruined by shoddy writing and bizarre performances. I think some of this would have been alleviated if everyone could have spoken Cantonese. Some of the basic thugs actually utter Cantonese phrases from time to time, so it's not as if Tequila came down with amnesia and forgot his native tongue. That said, there are a ton of John Woo flourishes throughout the game that make up for its lackluster plot. In one sequence, Tequila enters a bar where a jazz band is playing some music. He winds up in a Mexican standoff with gangsters, and the band stops playing. Instead of describing it, let me just show you.
Who told you to stop playing?
John Woo also makes his requisite cameo as the bartender early on, serving up a tequila slammer while practically winking at the audience. He's even unlockable in the game's multiplayer mode, which drops all pretense of telling a story and simply presents action without context. I'm also a big fan of how destructible the environments are throughout Stranglehold. Earlier games that copied Woo's cinematic flair, such as Max Payne and Fear, were able to nail the visceral thrills of debris flying off the walls when being shot, but those games weren't able to see actual pieces of scenery collapse onto enemies. Stranglehold makes it a feature, allowing players to enter a slow motion state known as tequila time and take shots at objects such as neon signs, scaffolding, and air conditioners to turn them into projectiles. This was all part of a technology known as Massive D that was incorporated into the game's engine to mimic that sense of frailty that Woo's film locations often had. That kind of pizzazz also extends to the interactivity Tequila has with certain environmental objects. In some locales, you can jump onto a cart and slide towards enemies while brandishing your akimbo pistols. You can slide down banisters, jump from chandeliers, and even walk up a dinosaur skeleton in one level. Woo isn't a game developer, but he helped with figuring out the camera placement for these bits to make them fit with his directorial style. Of course, he also added the white doves to one of Tequila's super moves that lets him clear out an entire room of enemies at once. It's really just this shame that, even for its short runtime, Stranglehold eventually becomes rote. Almost like a precursor to modern films being too long, Stranglehold presents interesting ideas up front before devolving into the same corridors and same shootouts. It's nice that the story doesn't really drag, but when all of the cool environmental details fall by the wayside, the game starts to feel padded. I don't believe that was the intention, but it's surprising how much like a modern blockbuster Stranglehold feels, despite being nearly 20 years old. Even with some of these flaws, the main thing I'd like to convey with this video is that I believe Stranglehold shouldn't go overlooked by fans of Woo's late 80s and early 90s action films. Maybe this isn't the best or longest game around, but it boils down Woo's essence into a digestible video game format that speaks to the very things that made his movies so beloved. It could have definitely used a better script, and I love to see it be redubbed into Cantonese, but Stranglehold is every bit as memorable and fun as Woo's classics. With it being readily available on PC with no DRM, it means you shouldn't have a hard time experiencing it for yourself. If you have enough time in the day, you can even turn it into a double feature alongside a rewatch of Hardboiled.